Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi made a visit to Pyongyang and held talks with his North Korean counterparts. And now much attention is on whether Kim Jong-un will visit China next month to mark the 70th anniversary of the establishment of Pyongyang-Beijing bilateral ties. This while denuclearization talks between North Korea and the U.S. still remain stalled and amid concerns of a possible weakening of South Korea-U.S. Japan trilateral ties following the termination of GSOMIA between Seoul and Tokyo. Today, we go in depth on the current geopolitical landscape surrounding the Korean Peninsula with Dr. Myong-hyun, research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. It's always good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi reportedly wrapped up. He was supposed to wrap up his three-day visit to Pyongyang today, but it's not yet clear whether he's returned home or not. But during his stay, he held talks with top North Korean diplomats Yong-ho and Soo-young. Although it's also unknown whether he will meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. How do you analyze the outcomes of his visit? Do you think his main focus was to set the stage for a possible North Korea-China summit next month?
That's probably the main motivation behind Wang Yi's visit to North Korea at this time. China is going to celebrate the 70 years anniversary of the foundation of the People's Republic of China next month, the October 1st. And for the Chinese government, this is going to be a very important occasion because one of the often heard criticism about Chinese diplomacy is that China has no allies in the region. China is surrounded by adversaries or potential adversaries. China's relationship with the neighboring countries are not always good, except perhaps a relationship with Russia. So I think the Chinese probably is under pressure to demonstrate that China is influential. It's very much welcome by the neighboring countries in the region, and for that, I think China needs to count with the help of traditional allies such as North Korea. And given that North Korea is very much a very opaque and hard to predict regime, I think that's the reason why Wang Yi came to Pyongyang personally to extend the invitation to Kim Jong-un. We know that Kim Jong-un has been invited to this kind of state celebration occasions before. For instance, Kim Jong-un was invited to Russia back in 2015 to participate in the Victory Day parade. But then North Korea, even though had expressed the intention to attend, Kim Jong-un decided not to go there at the last minute. So in that case, I think China wants to make sure that the Kim Jong-un attends this celebration in the next month. But in order to make sure of that, I think Wang Yi had to come to Pyongyang to convince Kim Jong-un to come.
Now, during his talks with top diplomat Soo-young, he said no power and no one can stop China's development and prosperity, and that Pyongyang and Beijing must protect mutual interests and their just rights through trust and communication. How do you interpret this?
I think the key part of this statement is actually the first part. The no power can interfere with China's and North Korea's mutual interest and rights and prosperity and so forth. I think the no power clearly is referring to the United States, and then Wang Yi is making reference to ongoing spat between China and the United States. And I think what Wang Yi is trying to say here is North Korea and China have a mutual interest in aligning together to confront this, you can say, like in the United States, a strong hand in East Asia. And this actually says a lot about some of the readings behind Wang Yi's visit to North Korea this time. There's some expectation that Wang Yi had gone to Pyongyang to relay a message from Washington that North Korea should go back to the negotiation table. But then with a statement like this, it's clear that the main agenda item in the talks between North Korean diplomats and Wang Yi wasn't about returning to the denuclearization negotiation with Washington. It was more about seeing coordination in their policy regarding the United States and probably Japan. So that shows that China is less interested in pressuring North Korea to go back to the negotiation table, but more about protecting its own interest.
Now, if Kim Jong-un makes a visit to Beijing next month, as many expect, would that bring about a change in the landscape of regional affairs surrounding the Korean Peninsula?
No, not likely. We already see all the dynamics necessary to predict what could be happening in a couple of months or next year. Sure, Kim Jong-un could go or could not go. Maybe he decided not to go to the parade the next month. But then what's important here is that China and North Korea have reaffirmed over and over that their interests are aligned. And then indirectly, that means that China is backing North Korea's hardline position in terms of negotiating with the United States. So that means that the fate of the current round of negotiation between Washington and Pyongyang is pretty much sealed, which means that it's unlikely that North Korea is going to come back to the negotiation table in the way that the United States wants North Korea to do it. I mean, for example, like North Korea to make major concessions in terms of denuclearization, and that's very unlikely now. So I think that's going to be the major challenge for both countries.
Now, speaking of which, the possibility of North Korea-U.S. working-level nuclear talks, once highly anticipated, is now gradually fading, as the North is showing no sign of returning to the table. In fact, Pyongyang's Vice Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee last week stated that the hopes on resumption of Pyongyang-Washington talks are dwindling. And against this backdrop, North Korea is increasingly boasting its close ties with China and Russia. How do you see this? Are we going back to the Cold War era?
Well, yes, I think all the signs are pointing in that direction. I mean, maybe you might call me a pessimist in this regard, but then it's clear that we are seeing an emergence of a bloc here in the East Asia with North Korea, China, and Russia on one side, and then we see United States and Japan on the other. South Korea is still on the fence in many ways regarding how to remain, in position-wise, how to remain in regards to this rise of blocs in East Asia. So this is going to be a major challenge. And I think the North Korean statement regarding the negotiation with the United States, I think the North Koreans are carrying out what they had promised to do earlier this year. North Korea, in a New Year's speech and the subsequent speech by Kim Jong-un in the State Council, announced that North Korea might explore new ways of dealing with foreign policy in general, and then in reference to the United States' hardline attitude towards the country. And for instance, North Korea stated that they might explore reaffirming their alliance with the socialist allies, meaning an alliance with Russia and China, and also they also mentioned that their patience might be running out soon, meaning they might be restarting the provocation cycle as well. So I think that North Korea is going to do both eventually. I mean, if the United States doesn't intervene at the right moment and then tries to convince North Korea to come back to the negotiation table by being more flexible regarding the denuclearization process.
Now, you've mentioned briefly about this, about my next question, but could you tell us more in detail about China's motives behind contacting North Korea now, at a time when North Korea-U.S. nuclear talks are stalled?
Well, I mean, I think China's motivation in contacting North Korea at the moment is probably independent of what the status of the negotiation between Washington and Pyongyang. I think China is contacting North Korea primarily because of the domestic reasons, such as celebrating the 70th anniversary among friends by inviting all the friendly countries around the world to Beijing to showcase how China has become influential and powerful. So that's probably the first motivation. But also there's also a shared interest between China and North Korea in being, assuming a hardline attitude towards the United States. The United States has been a little bit hard to predict in terms of behavior towards other countries in the last couple of years, especially because of President Trump's preference for remaining unpredictable regarding foreign policy. And I think that has created a lot of frustration, and not just among the allies, but other countries such as China and North Korea. And China and North Korea by now, probably they believe that in order to influence the American behavior towards them, they need to somehow ally with each other and then create a bloc. And I think that what we're seeing right now is the emergence of the bloc that's going to confront the United States in this region.
Now, another thing worth taking note of is the contact between North Korea and Russia. Vice Premier Lee Yong-nam is in Vladivostok for the 5th Eastern Economic Forum, and his delegation is set to hold a range of talks with their Russian counterparts. How do you see that?
Well, I mean, we know that, again, going back to the earlier speech by Kim Jong-un, he promised to reaffirm or rebuild his relationship with the socialist allies, and that includes Russia. So, I mean, we know that North Korea attended the One Belt, One Road forum organized by China earlier this year. So it only makes sense for North Korea to participate in the Eastern Economic Conference sponsored by the Russian government, because for Russian government, the development of the Russian Far East is one of the top economic priorities that government has right now. And they see North Korea as a key piece in the puzzle, because for Russia, it's important to reach the major energy markets such as South Korea and Japan. And North Korea, in a way, is standing in between Russia and the major markets that Russia is trying to reach out to. And somehow, I think Russia needs to convince North Korea to embrace this strategy of reaching out to Japan and South Korea and cooperate with Russia in this regard. And I think that's the reason why Russia is trying to entice North Korea to somehow agree with the vision, economic vision that Russia has for this region.
So North Korea-Russia economic cooperation will definitely be one of the top agenda during their talks this time around. Meanwhile, here in Seoul, concerns are rising over the possible weakening of South Korea-U.S. Japan trilateral security ties with the termination of GSOMIA. Do you think South Korea's withdrawal from GSOMIA would somehow affect Washington's strategy in the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, definitely. Most definitely that's going to affect the American strategy in this region. I mean, and that's the reason behind the harsh reaction coming from Washington against the Moon administration. And I think the United States has invested a lot in building a trilateral cooperation between Korea, Japan, and the United States. And despite all the political obstacles and outstanding historical issues between Korea and Japan, but then they just saw that the whole these efforts went to waste in a single sweep by the decision made by the South Korean government. So I think the United States would like to rebuild the structure again, but I don't think I think they're having a hard time seeing how. And I think one of the options they're entertaining is probably strengthen the role of the United Nations Command in the Korean and South Korea, because that's the way for the United States to remain influential in the security policy of South Korea.
Which leads to our next question. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff confirmed yesterday that Seoul and Washington recently discussed the issue of commanding authority over South Korean military after the transfer of wartime operational control. And the U.S. reportedly claims that the UN command should have the operational authority over the South Korean military after the OPCON transfer, while South Korea reportedly argues otherwise. Your take?
So this is a very interesting issue. I mean, it's a little bit legalistic in many ways, but then in order to understand the context of what's going on, we have to go way back to the Korean War. I mean, the Korean War wasn't just a war between North Korea and South Korea. It was the war between North Korea. In fact, it was a war between North Korea and the United Nations. South Korea was supported by 16 nation-strong contingent, and the United Nations actually remained after the end of the Korean War to somehow keep the peace in the Korean Peninsula. That's why we had the United Nations Command for a long time. But then that structure had a modification over the years, and one of the modifications that happened in the 70s was transferring the wartime operational command control from the UN command to the Combined Forces Command, which is just composed of two nations, South Korea and the United States. But now that we are talking about transferring the wartime operational control back to South Korea, then what's happening is that we have to question the role of the UN command at this juncture, and there was some expectation in South Korea that UN command didn't matter anymore because it became essentially redundant after CFC, Combined Forces Command, came into being in the late 70s. But now we are hearing talks from Washington that the United States would like to revitalize the role of the UN command. And legalistically, that makes total sense because despite the end of the Korean War, the Korean Peninsula, in terms of security, is still governed by in terms of legal framework, it's still governed by the armistice agreement reached between the United Nations and North Korea and China on the other hand. So in that sense, in the legalistic terms, United Nations Command still plays a major role in determining the security situation in the Korean Peninsula. So, and we know that structure-wise, the head of the U.S. forces in South Korea, in this case, General Robert Abrams, actually has another head. It's also the head of the United Nations Command. So even if South Korea gets the wartime operational control back from the Combined Forces Command, and Combined Forces Command disappears and replaced by, say, like the Future Command, General Robert Abrams still will be the head of the UN Command, which in terms of in legal sense, it occupies a higher dimension than the South Korean Command. So in that sense, the U.S. general will still able to call the shots in case of contingency in the Korean Peninsula, and that way, United States can remain an influential power in the security situation in the Korean Peninsula, even though the wartime operational control would have passed back to South Korea.
One last question for you, just very briefly. Now, with all these pending issues lying ahead, how do you forecast future dynamics of regional affairs surrounding the Korean Peninsula?
Oh, that's a tough call, clearly. But then we see like a divergence in many ways between the existing, like a security cooperation structure between Korea and Japan and the United States. Korea clearly wants to chart an independent path from Japan and the United States. That's the reason why South Korea is fighting back this potential move by the United States to revitalize the UN command, because that would mean that South Korea will still have to answer the security decision made by the United States. So this is one thing that's going on this side of the region, meaning Korea, Japan, and the United States. But on the other hand, on the other side of the region, namely different bloc, namely composed by North Korea, China, and Russia, we see a growing coordination among these three countries. So this, so we are seeing a little bit of a disorder and tension on the say like the liberal democratic bloc, but we see like a growing coordination and cooperation among the more authoritarian countries. And this is it's a recipe for like could be more tension and more conflict down the road, because especially North Korea will be able to tell that the South Korea's security security like a position is weakening right now because of lack of coordination with the United States and Japan, and that could create space for more provocation coming from North Korea in the coming months and years. So this is I would say we are entering a dangerous phase in terms of security in this region.
It sounds quite concerning, but that is all the time we have for you. Thank you, Dr. Go, for your perspectives.
My pleasure.
And that wraps up our show. Thank you, as always, for being with us.